Kia ora koutou, everybody, and welcome to the second of our masterclasses. It's really great to see so many of our Climate Leaders Coalition signatories joining us this morning, as well as members of the Sustainable Business Council. We could, if we wanted to, dub the last 4 weeks as sort of a version of Mad May, in the sense that it's been a big month for the government on climate change, with the release of the draft National Adaptation Plan, our first emissions budgets, the emissions reduction plan, and then sort of budget 22 to round all of that out. These government announcements are a significant milestone in our transition to a zero carbon future. So with the coalition and the SPC, as we so often do things together, it's really great to see so many of our recommendations reflected in the government's first emissions reduction plans. So we very much appreciate the chance to have a say and be heard. However, the ERP now gives us the framework that we must urgently deliver on. And this will require both business and government working together at unprecedented scale and pace to meet the challenge ahead. And I've certainly said privately, and I'll say it in a forum like this, that we continue to signal to the Minister for climate change in particular that we're up for this particular challenge, and that businesses are already taking action across what we consider to be the 3 climate pillars, those being mitigation, adaptation, and transition. By the end of June, the coalition will launch its 3rd statement of ambition. So we have a 2017 version, a 2019 version that very much reflect the context we're in at that point in time. And we're in a completely different context now, or a further evolution from what we said previously. So we do want to reflect our signatories' desire to unite New Zealand businesses to accelerating that transition, getting after that zero carbon, and doing it in a way that's both resilient and just to all concerned. That's sort of my opening comments. With all of that, I'd like to now say a very, very warm welcome to the Minister for Climate Change, James Shaw, who's going to talk with us some more about what the emissions reduction plan means for business. All of the people on this Zoom meeting today have a critical role to play in delivering the ERP. And I know that we're all going to appreciate the opportunity to hear from you, Minister, and to ask questions. And as we move past your opening comments and your presentation, so to speak, then I'll pass things across to Lorette to manage our time together in terms of Q&A and the rest of the session. So Minister, very much welcome, and I'll pass across to you.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Good morning, and Mike, thank you very much for having me on the show, and to the team at Z for hosting, and the Climate Leaders Coalition and Sustainable Business Council for all of the work that you've put into this over the course of, well, actually many years now, but especially over the course of the last few months to help us get the emissions reduction plan over the line. And welcome also to all of those of you. I recognise a number of people on the Zoom. It's lovely to see you again. And also there are some people I don't recognise, and that's great. We get to meet for the first time. So thank you for being a part of it and for giving up your morning, or part of your morning, to be with me to talk this through. I've got a slide deck, which I'm going to talk you through, just kind of giving the overall strategy that sits behind the emissions reduction plan. I won't talk it through in detail. The plan is 287 pages long, with over 200 pages of appendices. So that would take more time than any of us have got available to us. But it is available at all good Ministry for the Environment websites for you to peruse at your leisure. So let me just kind of bring up my slideshow. I did just want to say also that whilst you can download the entire emissions reduction plan, it will also shortly be published in its constituent chapters, because I know some of you will have more interest, for example, in transport than agriculture, or vice versa, and so you can kind of get into the bits of that you're most interested in. But how is it all put together? So I guess the most important thing that I want to say is that after many years, we finally have a clear pathway to cut greenhouse gas emissions, to create jobs, to improve lives and livelihoods, and unlock new investment. 4.5 years ago, when we got into government, we got to work on what would quickly become the largest government work program on climate change that this country has ever engaged in. Embedding this work in a single framework that would require every single future government to take action to cut emissions was the job of the Zero Carbon Act. And it is that legislation that conceived of this emissions reduction plan. Now, exactly 3 years ago this month, the Zero Carbon Bill had its first reading in Parliament. And in the House, I said that cutting emissions, or the challenge of cutting emissions, should provide the best opportunity that we have ever had to change our communities for the better. So the emissions reduction plan is a blueprint for low carbon Aotearoa that will create well-paying jobs and upgrade the country to run on more clean energy, to support nature and to improve infrastructure. Together, the more than 300 actions that are contained within this plan and the several $billion of investment that is backed up with add up to a future that I hope that we can all be proud of. The end of coal, that most harmful of substances that we have used since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, gone for good. Kids walking or cycling to schools, and the schools themselves powered by renewable energy. Fast and frequent and convenient buses and trains like New Zealanders deserve. More people getting around in electric vehicles. Families raising their kids in homes that are warmer and drier and healthier, and then with the savings of that showing up in their electricity bills every month. Aotearoa New Zealand's first emissions reduction plan puts us on a pathway to meet our long-term targets to the year 2050, in line with the 1.5 degrees temperature threshold. It builds on the progress that the government's made over the last 4 years, and it also responds to the recommendations of He Pou Arangi, the Climate Change Commission. The plan contains strategies, policies, actions to reduce emissions right across the country to achieve our first emissions budget and to support all New Zealanders to make the most of the transition. But it is not job done. A plan on its own does not cut climate pollution. It'll take changes both large and small that together add up to a better, a cleaner future for all of us. Now, here's the next question. Here we go. So the emissions reduction plan is based on 5 principles. The first is that we need to start with what we need to do to play our part in the worldwide effort to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, so that current and future generations are protected from the floods and fires and droughts and storms of a changing climate. That then flows into our Te Reti o Waitangi commitments and empowering Māori to respond to the particular risks and opportunities for Māori and the Māori economy. And that occurs alongside an equitable transition that leaves no one behind and takes everyone with us, as well as working with nature rather than against it to solve both the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis together. Those considerations then collectively drive the ultimate outcome, which is a productive, sustainable, and inclusive economy that works for everyone. So this map shows how those principles inform our strategy. And you'll find the full version of the strategy map in the first few pages of the executive summary of the emissions reduction plan. And the full version of that map also includes the individual chapters of the emissions reduction plan. So you can see how we've structured the plan to give effect to the strategy, which in turn flows from these 5 principles. So as I said, the whole strategy starts with what we need to do to play our part in the global effort to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. We'll do that by meeting our 2050 targets, which are now set out in the Climate Change Response Act and through our nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. As we all know, I mean, our best scientists have already told us what it is that we need to do, and this plan is designed to make that happen. In total, there will be 6 emissions budgets and corresponding emissions reductions plans to take us out to the year 2050. Each emissions budget will act as a stepping stone to lower emissions, and each plan will include the necessary policies and strategies to meet that budget. Our first emissions budget requires us to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by a further 11.5 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent over the course of the next 4 years. To ensure that the transition for Māori is inclusive, fair and equitable, the plan outlines how we intend for Māori and the government to work in partnership to develop a new platform for Māori climate action, to develop a Māori climate strategy and action plan, and to provide funding and resourcing for community action, kaupapa Māori, and tangata Māori actions and solutions. So for example, the plan includes specialist support for whenua Māori entities, farmers and growers. And we're continuing to support marae to upgrade to install clean energy like solar through the Māori and Public Housing Renewable Energy Fund. If we work to ensure that the opportunities of the transition are available to everyone, that is our best route to long-term success. On the other hand, we know that we will not succeed if we allow the transition to further entrench the existing inequalities in our economy and in our society. So to this end, the government will develop an equitable transition strategy, including proactive transition planning with Māori and other communities that will be most affected by the transition itself. Measures to support workers to transition to low emission sectors and to avoid job losses, working alongside the unions and businesses, and actions to support households and communities to benefit from the transition. So that's why, for example, this plan builds on the success of the Clean Car Discount with new approaches to making low emissions vehicles more affordable and accessible for everyone. The protection of our rainforests, the renewal of our wetlands, and the protection of our endangered species, as we all know, are urgent and absolutely critical in and of themselves. But those things also provide solutions to the climate crisis. We know that the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis are inextricably linked and also have the same root cause. The climate crisis is caused in part by the destruction and loss of our wilderness areas, both on land and in the sea. So, for example, we will prioritise nature-based solutions in our planning and our regulatory systems. We'll report on biodiversity as part of our emissions reductions plan reporting system, and we'll establish an integrated work program that delivers climate and biodiversity and wider environmental outcomes. So the plan includes support for Indigenous afforestation and also includes commitments to natural infrastructure like wetlands in our planning system and planning reforms. So you can see how those first four principles both drive and shape the final outcome, which is an economy that's much more inclusive, much more productive, and much more sustainable than the one that we have today. Much more productive in the sense that the challenge of continuing to develop and grow our economy whilst also simultaneously dramatically cutting emissions should be the single biggest driver imaginable of innovation and creativity, of new clean tech businesses, higher paying jobs, and more resilient supply chains. More sustainable in the sense that the protection and restoration of our natural world will be at the heart of our work to develop a climate-friendly economy. And more inclusive in the sense that the transition takes everyone with us and leaves no one behind, and where Māori are empowered to manage the risks and also take advantage of the opportunities to Māori and the Māori economy. Now, to make that happen, we need to make sure that our overall system settings support those outcomes right across the economy, and also that we work with our sectors and industries to both cut emissions and also to find new opportunities. Now, system settings are those whole of economy tools of pricing, regulation, policies and investment that help to support change and drive the overall transition. A balanced mix of system settings will lead to more investment in key areas like renewable energy. It'll drive innovation and nurture emerging technologies and industries. So in terms of the emissions reduction plan, this means using emissions pricing to provide the right incentives for businesses, including in agriculture, to cut pollution and to invest in clean tech alternatives. Greening the financial system and the investment markets so that capital flows naturally towards low carbon investment and away from more polluting industries. Getting New Zealand's planning and infrastructure systems and processes into shape, which is important in its own right, but again, to accelerate the transition in our cities and our towns and our industries. Reshaping the research and development, science and innovation systems to drive transformative change in some of our most challenging parts of the economy. And finally, developing strategies to make use of our existing resources and to replace non-renewable resources with renewable resources wherever possible, as fast as possible. Now, getting our economic settings right will, of course, support climate action in every part of the economy, but we do also need to work with key emissions-intensive industries and sectors to support them to both cut emissions and to find new opportunities. That means making it cheaper and easier to access EVs, decarbonising heavy freight, and also supporting people to walk, cycle, or take public transport. It means phasing out fossil fuels and massively ramping up renewables in transport, electricity generation, and industry. It means lifting the quality of both home and commercial construction with the use of sustainable low-carbon building materials, accelerating the rollout of practices, technology, and tools for cutting emissions on farms and in agricultural industries, increasing the supply of woody biomass to replace coal and other high carbon fuels and materials, and encouraging native forests as long-term carbon sinks. Cutting the amount of waste going to landfills, including food waste, and investing in waste infrastructure and landfill gas capture, and requiring refrigerants to be captured and destroyed when heating and cooling systems reach their end of life. The first emissions reduction plan does lay the groundwork for a wide-ranging economic transition over many years. We're not aware of any other initiative other than the budget itself, which brings in such a large span of government. And while it has taken a tremendous effort, endless briefings and reports and papers, and a frankly gargantuan amount of work from countless officials, the plan will not implement itself. So the Prime Minister will chair the Climate Emergency Response Group of Ministers, who will have overall governance and oversight of the emissions budgets and the plan. The existing ad hoc Climate Change Chief Executives Board is being formalised into a fully fledged interdepartmental agencies executive board under the Public Service Act 2020, and that will report up to the Climate Emergency Response Group of Ministers. Ministers and chief executives have individual responsibility for their part of the plan, but they also have collective responsibility for achieving the overall emissions budgets. And the Independent Climate Change Commission will monitor progress on an annual basis and will report publicly. When we got re-elected in late 2020, we, by November of the same year, declared a climate emergency. Now, we are taking that seriously and we are treating it with the gravity that it demands. And we are setting up the mechanisms to ensure that our response to that emergency succeed. So this first emissions reduction plan will mean that more New Zealanders will be supported to purchase EVs so that zero emission vehicles will make up at least 30% of the light fleet by 2035. The amount of waste going to landfills will be reduced and most households in the country will have curbside food waste collection by 2030. There will be faster, more convenient, cheaper public transport, including major infrastructure projects in Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch, and nationally integrated ticketing. From 2025, only zero emission buses will enter the fleet, and by 2035, the entire public transport bus fleet will be decarbonised. Low emissions trucks will carry food and goods and will cut freight emissions by 35% by 2035. Most of our biggest businesses will be powered by clean, renewable energy generated here in New Zealand and not exposed to volatile international commodity prices. We will end our reliance on coal with a ban on new low to medium temperature coal boilers and a phase out of all of the existing ones by 2037. There will be a price on agricultural emissions in place by 2025, and farmers and growers will be supported to reduce emissions with proven practices, tools, and technology, and our native wildlife and forests will be restored and protected. Now, meeting our emissions budgets will require all of us to make immediate reductions where we can, and also to lay the foundations for a more productive, a more sustainable, and a more inclusive future. The transition will require significant change. So it is going to take all of us, and it is going to take everything we've got. But with that change comes an incredible opportunity to improve well-being, to become more productive, to increase resilience, to lower the cost of living, and to rectify generations of inequality. So tackling climate change, as I have said before, many of you will be bored of me saying it by now, it is truly a once-in-a-generation opportunity to build a future that is more equitable, more prosperous, and more innovative, and all within planetary limits. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Thank you, Minister Shaw. Just before we open the floor for questions and answers directly of you, I just thought that I would provide just a couple of housekeeping things before we do this. And so, firstly, I want to acknowledge you, Minister Shaw, and also Mike Bennett's on the call today, and all of our signatories across SBC, CLC, and then also SBC. But also, just I see that we put in the chat that there's, if you wouldn't mind putting your cameras on, just we want to make this as engaging and as direct communication with yourself and the Minister. And then what we'll do, if you could please raise your hand now, and if you've got any questions, then we will unmute you and you can ask it directly of Minister Shaw. And we also, if you feel more comfortable, please feel free to put it into the chat and we'll read it on your behalf. And so in the meantime, I do see that we have had a question come through, so I'll just start with that. So before we move to Adam and then to anyone else as well. But the first is from Jess, and Jess is from IAG. And so her question is, so you mentioned at the start the end of coal, but her understanding is that the ERP is still silent on the future of Huntly, and we have stepped back from the 100% renewable electricity target in favour of a broader energy target. So what is the current thinking around Huntly and coal/gas for electricity generation?
Well, look, I think we want to get out of coal for electricity generation as fast as we possibly can. And the kind of thrust, if you like, of the sustainable energy strategy that's kind of hinted at in the emissions reduction plan is that we are shooting for a fully renewable system, that we would like that to be by 2030. And we still have this very significant problem of a winter period where electricity goes up, water reserves go down, and we have a gap. And so we need a significant amount of stored energy. And so Megan Woods is leading on the New Zealand Battery Project, which is looking at a number of options, the most famous of which is the Lake Onslow pumped hydro system, which essentially says, well, rather than storing an entire winter's worth of peak energy in coal, let's store it in water and use it that way. That is essentially the proposition there. So there are, in the plan, you'll have noticed there's a lot of decisions yet to be made, and the plan says, well, we do intend to make these decisions, but not every T is crossed by the time we publish the plan. So that's all still in train. The Interim Climate Change Committee, actually, before we even wrote the Zero Carbon Act, did say that we should focus primarily on a renewable energy target for the entire energy system, because of course emissions from electricity generation only form a comparatively small part of total emissions from energy. And so we have lifted the focus to that. But Megan and the government are still very committed to renewable electricity generation within that as well.
Thanks for that. And then if you've got any follow-up questions, just feel free to pop them in the chat and we can ask them of the Minister. And then otherwise we'll now move to Adam.
Adam, you've got a lot of work to do.
Hey, James. Yep. Obviously, Adam from Waste Management here. Yeah, great work on the plan. Glad to see it in action after fighting just to get an act 4 years ago. My question's more of a technical one. So the IPC, the budgets the government sets uses the IPCC 5 version for creating the rules, and MFE is still using IPCC 4. So the latest greenhouse gas inventory done by MFE a couple of months ago is using a different calculation for methane and all that stuff, which gives a different figure. So I'm just curious how we're going to map the 290 for the first budget when the inventory come from MFE. The example being in 2019, for example, the budget using the IPCC 4, I think 79 tons, whereas the IPCC 4 was like 75. So they don't really match.
Yeah, well, this is a kind of a gearing problem between the IPCC's timeframe and our own, and when advice drops from the Commission versus when we respond as well. So there is a gearing problem in there. But what we do in our reporting cycle is that we smooth that out historically. So in each round of the cycle, what we do is we go back and kind of essentially recalculate our historicals using the updated numbers. So there's always a zone of inaccuracy in all of this, and the science on this, as you well know, kind of gets updated on actually quite an astonishingly fast time scale. And so we're always in this position of saying that we're going to set targets according to this calculation. And we also know that by the time we get to that destination point, there will be one, if not two, sets of recalculations that occur. So that essentially is just one of the kind of challenges that we have to deal with in the system that we've got.
Does that mean that MFE is going to recalculate using IPCC 5 guidelines next year as opposed to keep using 4?
We've also got AR6 coming out in the not too distant future as well, right? So so we have to kind of smooth backwards for those things as well when they happen. But remember that the Climate Change Commission are due to provide their next set of advice about the second, third, and fourth emissions budgets in I think towards the end of 2023, which is only next year. And then that will inform the government's second emissions reduction plan for dealing with the second, third, and fourth, and that will include a recalculation of everything that you see in the current plan. So it does mean that, you know, there is a bit of a moving target, but we kind of hold ourselves accountable on that basis and say, well, we work with the calculations that we were given at the time, and then we correct over time.
Oh, that's good to hear. I heard that MFE weren't keen to update, so if they're updating as the new guidelines come out, that's great to hear. Thanks for that.
Awesome, thanks, Adam. What I also should say is when you unmute, are able to just introduce yourself and your organisation, I think would be really useful. So I'll just pass now to you, Brett.
Hi, Brett Woods here from Contact Energy. So just a bit of a comment first, and then a question after that. The comment is regarding GIDI. We're really pleased to see that change. I think that the putting the target out there to improve total energy consumption is a goal we're really proud to be part of and are really pushing for. And often that GIDI funding is the thing that can help get things across the line to help electrify things that aren't at the moment. So that's something we've got a big thumbs up for. The question is, I saw in the document there was a couple of mentions of, not exactly sure how it was worded, but a desire for more government power purchase agreements. But I didn't see much on how that was intending to work, what was meant there. So I just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, and Brett, that's probably because final decisions on that haven't yet been made. So this is one of those things I'm going to be swimming in somebody else's ministerial lane here for a second, but I know that is something that Megan is particularly interested in, but to my knowledge hasn't yet gone to Cabinet on. So I would just say watch this space.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brett. And so we've got another question in the chat just from Jess at IAG again, and it says, given the working with nature focus, keen for your thoughts on the role of alternative offset options like mangroves as a way to both help companies offset unavoidable emissions and also address climate adaptation.
Yeah, so we've actually funded those. We've made a decision, which is essentially an in-principle decision, which is that we want more sequestration options available to us than forests alone. I mean, forests are obviously critically important, both the short-term cycle of those plantation forest, exotic forests, as well as the permanent native afforestation for those really long-term carbon sinks. But we also know that mangroves, wetlands, some options around marine and so on also have great sequestration potential, but haven't yet passed the threshold for us to be able to say with confidence that they can, restoring a wetland, for example, will yet meet the quality standard that it needs to be in the emissions trading scheme. But we're funding that through this budget from the Climate Emergency Response Fund to kind of get that science done. So we haven't said, yet that we will include something in the ETS because it does need to meet a series of thresholds. But if we can, we will.
Thanks, Mr. Shaw. And now just pass to Kat.
Kia ora, Minister. Thank you for talking to us today. I'm Kat Rowe from Silver Fern Farms. First of, congratulations on the ERP. Like you said, a mountain of work from a number of people. So just to acknowledge that and to say thank you for involving companies like Silver Fern Farms in those conversations. We've really appreciated being part of that, and we thought particularly the sections on agriculture were really improved and strengthened by that collaboration between the private and public sector. So thank you for that. We were really pleased to see the focus on nature-based solutions really coming through, and that I guess the strengthened articulation of that link between biodiversity and climate change. We're trying to go as fast as possible in that area. I think you know that. But one of the challenges we're really encountering is access to expertise and labour and people to help us do that, whether it's planting trees or mapping sequestration on our farms. So I'm just really interested to know your thoughts in a bit more detail about how we might remove some of those barriers and go as fast as we want to go.
Yeah, look, Kat, that's a challenge everywhere in pretty much every sector of the economy, but also because in particular exacerbated in some of the key areas around the emissions reduction plan because we're starting from a really low base. So it's not like there are people who you can easily transfer from, kind of one area to another area because, it's about workforce development. And there is a sort of a nascent reference, if you like, to workforce development in the Equitable Transitions chapter of the emissions reduction plan, but it is an area that I actually think is undercooked and needs a lot more work. And I think it would be great to have Silver Fern and other companies kind of weigh in actually explicitly on that area, because I think it's one thing for agencies to kind of say, well, this is the kind of policy domain and we've got funding available, but if there are no people to do the work, you're kind of a bit stuck. So we do know that capacity is a real issue. And like I said, I think companies have weighed in on various aspects of the plan, but that's not an area that I think has yet got quite the level of examination. The equitable transition strategy work will be starting now because it's been funded through Budget 22. And it's been led by Stu Nash and Carmel Sepuloni, although there's a number of other ministers involved, including Minister of Education, Workforce and Development, for exactly that reason. But the primary location for that work is in MB, which is convenient and deliberate in the sense that is also where things like industry transformation plans and so on is also being led from.
Thanks, Mr. Shaw. So just want to encourage everybody, if you've got any further questions, to raise your hand. But I guess in the meantime, there's a question that we do have, and it is just around, I guess, a lot of our members have seen that the emissions budgets and the emissions reduction plan has been directed to the Environment Select Committee, and we just wondered whether you'd be able to provide a little clarity on that, or what you are able to add into why that is, and what sort of engagement you would like from business on that.
Well, of course, a Parliamentary Select Committee is outside the domain of a minister. It's a parliamentary process rather than a governmental process. Eugenie Sage is the chair of the Environment Select Committee. So I think probably the best thing to do is to contact her. And the purpose of it going to the Environment Select Committee is so that they can essentially give it a good kicking from a parliamentary perspective, and to perhaps make recommendations back to government about, prioritisation or resourcing, or kind of questions about detail and so on. So I think in that sense, it's a really good process. But like I said, it is a parliamentary process rather than a governmental process.
Thanks, Minister Shaw. And now I see that Frederick also has his hand up, so we'll pass to Frederick. Oh.
Yes. Good morning, Kia ora. Thank you very much. So my name is Frederick Cornu. I'm working for WSP, and I'm also leading the development of the community of Time for the Planet in New Zealand. Time for the Planet is raising €1 billion to create 100 companies reducing or capturing greenhouse gas emissions on a global scale. So my question relates to the latest IPCC report, and basically limiting warming to around 1.5 degrees requires global greenhouse gas emission to peak before 2025 at the latest, and be reduced by 43% by 2030. And my question is basically, how does the ERP stands or compare to this IPCC report?
Yeah, so assuming it works, the emissions budget that we have between now and 2025 will mean that this is the period of time that New Zealand's net emissions peak and then start to fall. So in that sense, it kind of reflects the latest IPCC report. There is quite a lively debate about the way that we measure progress and the way that we measure targets, which is currently the subject of a judicial review. I'm going to be pretty interested to kind of see where that lands. Essentially, the Climate Change Commission's job within the constraints of the Climate Change Response Act for us to start with what's scientifically required, and they use the IPCC as their kind of base reference point, and they use the last IPCC report as the basis of that, and then to say, well, what should New Zealand's contribution to that global effort be, based on what we know about what our domestic economy can do in the time available. And because New Zealand has been, like most countries, very late to get started, there is a gap between what we should do and what we can do in the time available to us. And so our nationally determined contribution is a much, much larger number than our domestic emissions budgets, because essentially we're saying that we're going to take responsibility for a much larger share of global emissions than we think that we are able to do in the first 10 years of our nationally determined contribution. Now, my goal is, and the government's intention is, for us to bring those numbers into line over time, so that we are actually, so that our domestic economy's transition reflects our kind of fair share, if you like, of the global commons. And I would anticipate that in every 5 years cycle, as we do these emissions reductions budgets and plans, that of course we, like the conversation I was having with Brett before, we'll be updating our numbers and starting to kind of tighten that over time. And that reflects the Paris Agreement, which contains this ratchet clause, which is you start where you are with what you can do, but you progressively tighten as the momentum builds up in your economy and as the science evolves. So the science has evolved quite a lot since the Paris Agreement itself was signed in 2015. And you can see, even since the Climate Change Commission gave us their report in May of last year, only 12 months ago, that things have changed even since then. So I would anticipate that things will tighten as we kind of get into the process. The one other thing that I would just want to say about that is we worked very closely with the United Kingdom when we were developing the Zero Carbon Act. So we used a lot of their lessons learned from their own legislative and institutional framework, and they've had theirs for about 12 years now. And one of the things that they said actually is that the transition, once they got started, the transition was far faster and far cheaper than their most optimistic modelling. And that's because once you get past that hump, the stage that New Zealand is in right now of decoupling your economic growth and development from your emissions target and sort of starting to kind of create that wedge, that actually the momentum starts to take care of itself because it becomes the new normal in the economy. And so I'm anticipating us having much more room to move by the time we develop our second emissions budget, which, like I said, is only a couple of years away.
Thanks, Mr. Shaw. And now I see we've got Denny with his hand up, so pass over to Denny.
Cool, thank you, Larry. Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Denny Rood tōku ingoa, and kia ora, Minister Shaw. Thank you and congratulations for MFE and MBE and yourself for getting this all out there, and every other ministry and contributor. Don't want to leave them out either. Just a question around transport and around the vehicle fleet. So I noticed that the Climate Change Commission had a recommendation for ICE vehicles, internal combustion, to not be a part of our fleet, stopping imports from 2035. And the United Kingdom, I think, have brought forward their target, which was 2040 to 2030. And I was a little bit surprised to see that not come through in the final plan. I was just keen to hear some of your thoughts around how, if you would like to see that in there, or what and why it didn't make it through.
Well, it's because final cabinet decisions haven't been made, and it's true of a whole swag of different policy areas where the plan includes that we will make a decision within this emissions budget period, but the work hadn't been completed on that individual policy area. So there is a reference in there about ensuring that New Zealand doesn't become a dumping ground for kind of everybody's knockoff secondhand internal combustion engine vehicles whilst they're rapidly decarbonising their transport fleets. And an outright import ban would be the single most effective way to do that. But also remember that one of the things that we've done recently is we've brought in the Clean Car Standard alongside the Clean Car Discount, which is a tailpipe emissions standard on the imported fleet, which actually cycles down to zero. And so it kind of has that effect. And so whilst Cabinet hasn't actually completed the work program leading to that decision about the mechanism, it is in effect already there through our declining emissions standards.
Great, thanks, Minister Shaw. And now I see that we've just got a question in the chat, so I'll go to Ben's question, then I'll come to you also, Nicholas. So the question from Ben Smith at Auckland Transport reads, Kia ora, Minister Shaw. My question relates to transport funding and local government. Many councils have declared a climate emergency and set ambitious greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. Auckland Council's Te Taruku Taiwhiri is Auckland's climate action plan aspires to reduce Auckland transport greenhouse gas emissions by 50% from 2016 levels by 2030. However, funding through the National Land Transport Fund is already constrained and Auckland's aspiration is greater than the national target. How will councils be supported to go further and faster towards transport decarbonisation beyond the actions identified in the emissions reduction plan?
Yeah, so there's kind of two components to that, one of which is the amount of funding in the National Land Transport Fund. So we spend about $7 billion a year in vote transport in central government. And you could double that number and you still wouldn't have anything like the kind of infrastructure that we need. So Michael Wood does have a work program on the future financing model for transport at the moment. And there kind of been hints of that about things like a review of how RUC works and so on. So that work is kind of in train. But even then, you know, we probably won't have quite what we need. The second component of it is we know that councils are stretched beyond the resources available to them. And Anaya Mahuta has a Future of Local Government work program going on, which includes looking at how the financing of local government occurs. So I think, I guess what I'm saying is I don't have an answer for that today, but the kind of two halves of that equation, which is how do you fund it nationally and how do you fund it locally, are being looked at through government work programs. The one thing that I would also say is that we are going to have to do it differently because we spend about $6 on infrastructure for every dollar that Australia spends on the same piece of infrastructure. So our infrastructure costs are just wildly disproportionate to what we get. We know that there's a lot of things in the system like planning and resource consenting and so on that contribute to that. And so the reform of Resource Management Act is one of the things that we need to do to bring that down. Creation of the Infrastructure Commission and the development of a pipeline should help to kind of standardize and build some stability into the system, which again should help to reduce costs in some areas, but it is something that we're going to have to look at. And I was recently enlightened about the transition that Copenhagen went through, because of course we all look at Copenhagen as this enlightenment city of sustainable living and sort of a utopian cyclist's dream, and it kind of is. But the reason that they got there is because they were on the verge of bankruptcy and they needed to develop transport infrastructure, but they didn't have any money. So they asked themselves the question, what is the cheapest form of transport infrastructure that they could do? And the answer was to convert existing land space into cycle lanes. It's cheap as chips compared with the alternative. And now, lo and behold, you've got this remarkable walking and cycling city that everybody looks at and says, well, how did you do that? And the answer is go bankrupt. So I think we just need to think quite carefully about how we, about the choices that we make about the money that we're already spending and the infrastructure that we've already got, and what can we repurpose where in ways that make sense, both in terms of the emissions outcome that we want, but also on a cost benefit basis.
Thanks, Mr. Shaw. And so Simon, I see your question in the chat as well, but I'll just go to Nicholas first, just for his question.
Kia ora, Minister, and ko Nico Vesio Toko Ingoa, and I am with Transpower. I'll join the rest of the group to say congratulations on this major piece of work. It's great to see real efforts towards decarbonization. Now, one thing in the ERP is a lot of the immediate reduction will rely on technology. Technology changes, and some of this technology will need to be imported if we want to meet the 2025 deadline. This is the only solution. Is the government worried that the supply chain, the global supply chain, will make it hard for New Zealand to import the technology we need, or are you seeing an opportunity to bring more of this technology on board?
Yeah, Nick, we are. We're very worried about it, and we know it's contributing, hugely to our own cost base at the moment. So, there's been some criticism of the budget as being this, big spend up, but a lot of that is actually just cost pressures due to rising inflation. So inflation affects everybody, and because the government is a very big spender, it then, the numbers get pretty eye-watering. So we are very worried about it. However, we're not expecting it to be a permanent state. So we think that some of the pressure on global supply chains will start to ease off in the second half of next year. That's kind of broadly the advice that we've been given, although I recognise these days, who knows. So we are going to have to play it by ear. Some of these things we've, that if you look at when the government announces a budget, it says, we're going to spend $600 million. That's not in a single year, right? That's spread out over 4 years. And so how we phase that money, you can, and if you dive into the detail of the budget documents, you'll actually see in a lot of cases that money is located in the years 3 and 4 of the spend cycle. And that's in part because we know that if we tried to spend it this year, we couldn't, we wouldn't be able to get the things that we want. So it is something that we're worried about. We also know that there may be opportunities for local manufacturing to respond as well. And I think we've seen a little bit of kind of reorganizing of some of those things. But yeah, some of the really big stuff that you're talking about, those massive Austrian wood chip boilers, for example, they're made in Austria. So that is what it is.
Thanks, Mr. Shaw. And then just coming back to Simon's question in the chat before, Glenn, being our last question for the session today before we need to close out. And so Simon's from Proxima, and he asks, given the urgency of addressing climate change and the slow start globally, how long can we wait until we need to take actions which may be more painful and less palatable for voters?
Well, look, it is a really good question. But I'm always very reluctant to kind of individualize climate action and to kind of place it on kind of households and individuals, because all of the choices that we have, or the lack of choices, are determined by, central government, local government, business, etc., making those options available to them. So, one of the reasons why it's difficult to convince people to give up their car parks to put in a cycle lane or to switch to public transport or to buy an EV is because those things aren't realistic to them right now compared with the alternatives. And it's pretty hard to argue you should get out of your car and catch the bus if there aren't any buses, or if they're irregular or expensive or inconvenient or a horrible experience. So the emphasis in the plan is on kind of, rewiring our cities, infrastructure, essentially making those options more available to people. And I think what you'll find is that things become more palatable to people the more things change, right? And the more people can see that they've got those options. We know that about 75% of the population generally consider climate change pretty important and want to do something about it. But about the same proportion of people feel that their options constrained and that they actually can't do much about it. And so I think at least in this first plan, the intention is to say, well, let's focus on those things that create more options for people.
Thank you. And now we'll just move to Glenn to provide the final question, and then I'll pass you to Mike Burrell just to provide some closing comments.
Thank you, Lorette. I'm Glenn Jones here from EnviroNZ. I'm the General Manager of Customers and Sustainability now. EnviroNZ obviously participates in the waste and recycling industry, and we have a fleet of over 700 sort of heavy vehicles which we operate on a national basis. And look, we're also we're committed to carbon-friendly fleet options and sort of moving away on a reliance of fossil fuels that we have today. One of my questions is really related around the 2023 commitment for sustainable sort of biofuels, which is going to come into effect. Now, obviously, as a heavy fleet transport user, we're always looking for alternatives, and obviously, biodiesel is certainly an option that we'd be keen to partake in if it was available, sort of on a national basis. It's very, very limited in its usage at the moment. Are you able to expand a little bit on the type of obligations that are going to come into effect in 2023, and potentially what impact that may have on the availability of biodiesel, sort of across New Zealand?
Only in a very limited sense, Glenn, because I'm not the Minister for Transport. And so Michael is quite across the detail of this in ways that I would do him a great injustice if I did try and bluff my way through. But essentially the obligation is that we'll be trying to amortize the cost of biodiesel by including a portion of it in every litre of fossil diesel. Right, so that's the kind of intention there, and that brings down. That means that biodiesel and fossil have the same price point, which of course they don't at the moment, and it also means that we have we're bringing down the carbon intensity of every litre of fossil petrol. So that's the intention behind that. But we also know that getting from kind of 0 to 60 is a bit of a challenge, right? Because we've got to build the infrastructure, and we've got to make sure that the feedstock, which we're hoping will be the wood waste from our forest sector, those supply chains need to be kind of sorted out, and we need to get the processing up in line. And probably what that means is we're going to be importing some stuff for a while until our domestic production gets up to this kind of scale that we need.
Great, thanks, Mr. Shaw. So that was our last question. And so, as I mentioned before, I now pass to Mike Burrell to provide some closing comments.
Thanks, Lorette. Well, Minister, first, a huge thank you from us. This is a big piece of work. This is a big deal, right? I think sometimes we get caught up in the kind of bureaucracy of it and forget that for 30 years we did bugger all. And suddenly in the last 4 years, a hang of a lot has happened, and it hasn't passed anyone's attention that that's under your leadership. So I think a huge congratulations to you, to the government, and also to all the officials behind the scenes that have done really, really hard work on this. It's not perfect. A plan will never be perfect, but this is good enough to be getting on with and building up the momentum that you were talking about before. So congratulations to you and your team. I also want to say thank you for listening. We've been providing input both right back to the beginning of when the government first came into power, through to the work that we've done with the Climate Change Commission, and then of course on the ERP. And it's been really gratifying to be heard. Sometimes that stuff doesn't get picked up and we understand why, but it's really good to see that a lot of it does get picked up. And of the 14 recommendations we made on the ERP, 12 of them to a greater or lesser extent are in there. And that again hasn't escaped our attention. And just thank you for the opportunity for dialogue and the transparency that you've shown around that. Of course, the hard work begins now. And I suppose my last thing would just be a plea, which is that the partnership continues. Our observation would be that there are a lot of kind of embedded behaviours that we see sometimes where people just want to keep doing things the way they've always done them. My plea to you and to the government in general would just be that we haven't got time for BAU. This is the BAU now. And so working in a real way with business, I think, is a way that you can accelerate. And as you've seen with this, the attention of the people today, there's real desire to be involved in the partnership to make this happen. So let's keep that going from our side. Looking forward to seeing you at the release of the new statement of intent on the 30th of June. And for those of you who don't know about that, that's going to be a big deal for us. But just a huge thank you from us, and looking forward to working with you as we go forward.
Thanks very much, Mike, and thank you very much. looking forward to working with all of you in the not too distant future.